Can I take this opportunity to welcome you to tonight's panel session titled Law and Democracy in Future Iran. Obviously, the Women, Life, Freedom Revolution in Iran is unprecedented in our nation's history. And I say our nations, us Iranians living both in exile and those who hopefully are joining us from inside our motherland. This revolution has been raising questions about the laying of foundation for a sustainable and ongoing and inclusive democracy for Iran in the future. And we have the very able minds of our panel members this evening. Can I take this opportunity to very quickly introduce myself? My name is Faraz Maghami, also pronounced as Faraz, as anglicized over the years. I am a Sydney-based barrister, although right now I'm in my very terribly lit hotel room in Canberra. I'm usually based out of Sydney. I have a pretty wide and versatile practice as a lawyer, and as a human rights activist. I've been covering a lot of international public and human rights law, and my work is an even split between some commercial aspects, but my main academic work and my human rights activities has always concentrated on the general public sphere. My work also includes matters pertaining to national security, organized crime, terrorism, and sanctions. And I appear in various capacities, either as advisor or as counsel. But enough about me. Let's talk about the important people that you are all here to both watch and listen to. Given the fact that we are yet to have our dear Dr. Ebadi, can I introduce to you a superstar who is not far from where I am, across the seas, Gloriz Ghahraman. Gloriz John is an Iranian Kiwi refugee and has made history as the first ever refugee to be sworn in as an MP in New Zealand. And having arrived in Aotearoa, am I pronouncing it right? I'm getting a nod.
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa. There we are. We are a little bit ignorant on this side of the water. Apologies. Having arrived as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran, she studied at Oxford and has had a career as a lawyer in New Zealand and overseas, and a barrister, I understand, and has focused on enforcing human rights and holding governments to account. Her work has included restoring communities after war and human rights atrocities, particularly empowering women engaged in peace and justice initiatives. In New Zealand, she has successfully advocated on human rights issues before the Supreme Court. And before entering Parliament, Gloriz John was active in the NGO community, as reflected by her broad and various roles that she has held, both in government and other roles. She volunteers her skills to advance justice reforms, refugee and migrant rights, both for family carers of disabled persons and others in need. She was part of a team, I'm told, that worked to prepare New Zealand's non-governmental report to the United Nations Committee on Rights of the Child. And in her first term as an MP, Gloriz was a member of the Foreign Affairs, Trade and Defence and Education Workforce Select Committee, a mouthful, and her work has included successfully...
Those are different committees.
Oh, different committees. All right. Thank you for that. There should have been a comma there somewhere. But I'm also told, trustedly, with commas this time, that her work has included negotiating New Zealand's military deployments in the Middle East and refocusing the work of the Defence Force on climate crisis, advocating for electoral funding reform and the restoration of voting rights to prisoners serving 3 years or less, and doubling the number of refugee families reunified, as well as financial support to bring them together. So, by that very poorly read synopsis, I think we can all agree that we have a superstar on the panel, and welcome Gloriz.
But Durud, thank you. That was a very lengthy, humbling. I think someone probably wrote that hoping you'd cut it in half, but thank you for that detailed introduction. I guess I would like to start, as I think we should start all conversations about what's happening in Iran, by acknowledging those on the ground leading this revolution. Their courage is absolutely exhilarating and terrifying. I think we can all sort of agree that this is unprecedented, because we are seeing a generation of Iranians who have never seen or experienced true freedom inside of Iran, absolutely facing torture and death for their rights. And that it's actually a very sophisticated, strategic revolution. So we're here to lift those voices. The other thing that makes this revolution unprecedented for me, and I think we can all agree, is the incredibly high level involvement of the diaspora Iranian communities all around the world. And this might be because it's now been 43 years since this regime has been in power, and we've all kind of grown up, those of us who have grown up elsewhere or established ourselves in various ways. So we have the ability to raise these voices and be involved. I've never seen in New Zealand the kind of engagement from my community. And of course, we've never had, for example, a member of parliament or a senior academic like Negar to raise these voices. So doing that work has been unique for all of us. So I can talk about the way that we've done that advocacy, but I would really like to speak as a lawyer in this context, in terms of what comes next. And my experience being with the United Nations in terms of justice initiatives that happen after atrocities, because I think as Iranians outside of Iran, this is something that we can help to endorse using the tools of international law and our own domestic human rights framework. So we owe it to any nation that goes through an atrocity as an international community to help with that transition. And I think that there is questions about the way that that transition can happen peacefully in Iran that will give life to this revolution if we can have those conversations starting now. So we need the transition to be peaceful. We need it to be human rights based. We need accountability for those responsible, but we need that to happen without violence, without mass violence, because that's what we see after a revolution most often, unless there is a clear, transparent, fair, human rights based framework for the transition. So my work, for example, in human rights missions or justice initiatives in the UN has been after the Rwandan genocide, after the Yugoslav war and genocide, or after the Cambodian crimes against humanity that happened. So those have been justice initiatives, but I think that in Iran, our focus needs to be multi-layered. And the research that we can point to is really clear. It's the thing that gives me hope is that there are these models. And so Iran can pick and choose between what might fit our experience best. And so we can look to places like South America where there's been fascist regimes. The biggest thing about what the research shows about transitional justice is that the victim communities, the massive, massive victim communities need the truth and the record to be made, and it needs to be aired. So there needs to be space for all of our communities, whether that's women, whether that's minority communities, like the Baha'i community, who has experienced a very different type of violence than other groups, whether it's the Baluch community, where we see, again, a very different type of attack, or the Kurds, the LGBTQI plus community, to tell their stories so that we have a record of the crimes, the atrocities that are being committed. And we need a clearing of the record, because we know that the regime, all regimes like this, lie about why someone went to prison, why they had to be executed. So to have that clear kind of exchange, we might look at something like a truth commission, a reconciliation process, And that might sit under a justice process. And the reason I talk about these things now, where it might seem really early, is that the unity that we all talk about as the diaspora community, which we absolutely need right now, has to be held up with the promise that afterward we will give space to this multi-layered justice process where we will have everyone's experiences captured, and we will have a different type of process where difference can be recorded. And that's the only way that a human rights framework can then be established. But there's also the question of justice. So we can tell the truth and we can have those spaces, but how are we going to hold people accountable? And that means the leaders, because we don't want the violence that they wrought. So we're not going to take them out back and shoot them. We're not going to hang them publicly. We're not going to torture them, because Iran deserves a process that goes forward where people then have trust in the institutions. Our institutions have to be as robust as the ones we point to in the West. We have to have a court system eventually that people can access and trust. And the only way that that can be established is if we have a human rights-based justice system when the absolute worst has happened. So even Khamenei, even the torturers will have trials, and we will have to resource that. So as the diaspora community, with our access to not only government aid in the United Nations system of resourcing these justice initiatives, we also have access to international law. We have access to international legal training. Some of us are barristers who are sitting here on this panel, and that's where capacity building will come in. We have to help capacity build Iran to ensure that we can have institutions that people can trust, and moving forward can set a record of, or a precedent for how we move forward. And then I guess the question comes up about reparations. And that's another thing that the international community can acknowledge. There has been those of us governments that have traded and profited from the atrocities that happen in Iran. And how can we make up for what the victims of these truth and justice initiatives have suffered? Is it going to be mental health care? Is it going to be community-based? So the Baluchistan can actually be resourced in a way that helps lift those people through the oppression that they've suffered. Is it higher education for the Baha'i community? Is it a different type of mental health access for the LGBTQI community? Do we have these records for reparation, or do we have them just for a reconciliation of broader society? But those questions have to be answered in Iran. I just think outside of Iran, we can help capacity build, and we can point to those international systems, and we can kind of provide that support going forward. But I've heard these questions over and over again when I turn up to protests from Iranians going, there's going to be mass violence. What happens when the regime falls? So it's helpful to say, actually, there's models that we can point to, and we need to start resourcing them now. And then finally, not to take up too much time, but I do want to talk about democracy a little bit, because I sit in a parliament. I'm elected to a multi-party parliament. And I think that we need to hold the absolute ambition of this revolution as a central part of what we see for Iran moving forward. This is a very ambitious revolution. It's not about just a little improvement. We're talking about overthrowing the whole regime. So to then point to just another sort of, well, we've come from a constitutional monarchy, so that didn't work, to a dictatorship. We need to be ambitious in the way that this revolution has been, and say nothing less than a multi-party, proper, participatory, proportional system will work for Iran, so that we can actually acknowledge Iranians are political. We are educated, we understand what democracy looks like. We have different voices, and there's nothing to fear in that. sure, the opposition right now, we absolutely are united in overthrowing the regime, but afterward, there's nothing to fear from having a proper, thriving democracy that is multi-partied. So people can actually participate in a meaningful way. We're not a subclass of the rest of the world as we've been treated. We can actually aim for kind of the best human rights-based democracy that there is. And that, again, is something that Iranians outside of Iran, with our experience of what that looks like elsewhere, can kind of support and insist upon as our governments come together to, ultimately we know that the West is going to get involved in negotiating whatever comes next. And we can help insist that there won't be anything less than the higher standard of democracy and democratic system. I think that's me.
Thank you very much, Gloriz. I am prompted and reminded to tell our dear audience members that please feel free to send in your questions. I assume in the chat box, and somebody is moderating it, although I'm supposedly the moderator. I'm the least tech savvy of all. So please send your questions in. And before I introduce our dear Dr. Partow in a minute, a reminder that not only your questions and comments are important, but it's critical that we continue to engage as a community, that the Iranian diaspora think about these things. And the only reason I raise that is the questions should hopefully be targeted towards a unified approach or a unifying type of question. But I'll come back to that in a minute and I'll explain it more. Can I take this opportunity now, whilst we're still waiting for our dear Dr. Ebadi, who's just emailed actually, so I think she'll join us soon. Dr. Negar Partow. Negar Jan teaches human rights and human security and political philosophy at Massey University in New Zealand. She is a public academic with extensive experience in teaching professional and various courses and workshops for both New Zealand Defence Force and New Zealand Police. Negar Jan has been working on human rights ethics in social sciences, humanities research, and has taught various courses, as I said, for both the Defence Force, the police, on Middle East, theories on international security, ethics, human security, etc. She works with diverse civil society groups, migrants, former refugees, like most of us, on issues relating to human rights and regular media, and is a regular media commentator on Middle East security and environment. Negar has published on human security and the United Nations, civil rights, religious political states, and other topics. And she was nominated for Women of Influence Award in 2018 for her work with migrant women, and has been a strong advocate for human rights. Her research extends to study of human security in international organizations, and if I were to continue going, I will take up the rest of your night. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Partow.
Oh, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. Thank you. I was very fascinated listening to Gloriz and, of course, discussions that Faraz and I had before, and with many of colleagues who are lawyers. And it's great to see that how there is a passion for institutions and thinking about how we can develop democratic institutions. And as a person, so my area of expertise is not law, but what I teach is understanding how political cultures operate and how the relationship between states and people can define the boundaries in which we define democracy. So one of the things that is very important for me is thinking about political culture. And by political culture, I refer to sets of narratives and rituals, especially social rituals that the system has got. Oh, we do have Dr. Ebadi here. Very welcome, Dr. Ebadi. We have systems and developments that create that creates procedures and that create narratives and define what is good and what is not good in the sense of political behavior and political advocacies and works. So, for example, if you think about democratic systems, even in the media interviews, the way that presenters and interviewers address a politician with their first name creates an equal platform in which the interviewers, for example, can ask very difficult questions and the politicians will remain accountable. So there is a connections between the ways that narratives, that rituals operate and the ways that institutions are developed. What is very fascinating to me as a person who works in this area is to know that we cannot always develop a system that works only through institutions and institutional systems, but we also have to work on the culture. And in fact, the burden of democracy and the burden of creating a democratic system that is functional and it's sustainable and doesn't result in a one-party political system, again, to me, it relies heavily on the role that civil society creates. And we have been thinking about democracy often in Iran in a political top-down system where there is a group or there is a party that would allow other parties or political figures to speak. What is interesting for us, for thinkers who think political culture, is the way that civil society creates limitations and defines those limitations between politics and security. In fact, one of the characteristics of democratic states, it's the boundaries that they define between politics and security. So the more security orientated they are, the more boundaries or red lines they have. If you think about democratic states, a lot of these issues that in Iran, for example, are redlined, like gender relations, like structures and universities and different platforms are often talked in real politics, everyday normal political interactions. But in the case of non-democratic states, these are all security issues that by passing through them, it actually creates more problems and kind of violation of human rights. So and security is costly. So these create more security challenges for states. But in our contemporary world, our definition of democracy should move beyond the traditional definition of political representation. And it has to become a definition that creates an inclusive civil society that is as sensitive to the rights of animals, to the future of energy, to the well-being of society, and to the ways humans interact and we use human and natural resources, be as sensitive to these things as sensitive to human rights and political representation. Now, we need to ensure that the future of these resources are guaranteed. Paying attention to the voices that are not heard, listening to difficult conversations. As Gloriz mentioned something about how we can actually develop systems that are just, but I also want to see that how we can develop civil society that is tolerant to listen to different conversations. The last 100 years of political history of Iran is full of groups, representations, of people and individuals who one way or another chose difficult or very wrong strategic decisions, and how we're going to deal with those wrong strategic decisions or wrong ideas is a very major question, and I think a great opportunity for us to develop something fantastic, not only a system that is better than what we have today, but a system that is the best that we can idealize. So as a person who's fascinated by discussions of democracies, I like to see questions like why one-party political system are reproduced in Iran, how to develop resilience and tolerance towards others whose views are not accepted? What would happen to the marginalized and excluded? Does Iran require an official religion? And many more questions that might not particularly be the matter of questions in a democratic setting, but it actually allows us to develop a civil society that is able to criticize itself and reform itself. So to me, the Woman Life Freedom Revolution signals to a very bright future in which the security of people, individual people, and communities and the environments that they have collectively becomes the foundations for a democratic system. But I believe that it is now time to discuss these concepts in practical terms, understand how we hear the voices of different ethnicities, the Kurds, Baluch, different ethnicities, Lords, everybody who lives in Iran and who wants a better future for Iran, how we can listen to the voices of environmentalists, to the rainbow community, how we can listen to the voices of people who are with disabilities. So all of these challenges and creating a model that is sustainable requires a lot of civil society engagement and discussion. And I really congratulate the Iranian community of Iranian scholars who developed a platform for these discussions. And I'm thanking all of you for listening to me. Thank you, Faraz, and everyone. And welcome, Dr. Ebadi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Partow. And that's a very good point. Inclusive engagement by all stakeholders of our society, I think, is the only way that Iran as a nation and Iranians as a people can succeed. And I think what comes to mind is the term unity and diversity. That is, whilst we're all diverse of various persuasions in different forms, we should all be united for the betterment of Iran. Now, I see that we have our dear Dr. Ebadi with us. Sarkar Khanum Ebadi Aziz, salam.
سلام بر شما.
خیلی ممنون دکتر ابادی عزیز. اگه شما اجازه بدین من شما رو معرفی بکنم به انگلیسی به تمام اودینسمون. یکی از دلایلی که این سشن رو به انگلیسی اصلا گذاشتیم اینه که خیلی از اتندیا انگلیسی زبان هستن، ولی من شما رو اگه اجازه بدین به انگلیسی معرفی خواهم کرد. بعدن شما نوتتون رو به همون فارسی ارائه بدین و مریم خانم ترجمه خواهند کرد بعدش.
خواهش میکنم.
I don't think that Dr. Ebadi needs any introduction, especially not from someone like me, but I am personally excited to have the opportunity to have Dr. Ebadi with us and to introduce her. Dr. Ebadi JD was awarded in 2003 the Nobel Peace Prize for her unfailing continued efforts to promote human rights, and in particular the rights of women, children, religious minorities, and political prisoners in Iran. She's the first Muslim woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize and only the 5th Muslim to receive the Peace Prize in this field. Dr. Ebadi was the first woman to become a presiding judge in Iran. She served as president of the City Court of Tehran from 1975 to 1979, and along with other women judges, was dismissed from that position after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. She was made a clerk in the court that she had once presided over as a judge, and until she petitioned for early retirement and she left. After obtaining her law degree in 1992, Dr. Ebadi set up private practice in Iran, and as a lawyer took on many controversial cases defending political dissidents, and as a result had been arrested multiple times and subjected to terrible treatment. In addition to being an internationally recognized advocate of human rights, she has also established many non-governmental organizations in Iran, including the Million Signatures Campaign, a campaign demanding an end to legal discrimination against women in Iranian law. And Dr. Ebadi is also a university professor, and often students from Iran take part in a human rights training in her courses. She has published 70 articles, 13 books on my count, and dedicated most of her work to aspects of human rights, and some of which have been published by UNICEF. As I said, I can continue to go on about Dr. Ebadi, but I think you all know a lot more than what I have said about our dear doctor. And the only final thing that I will say about Dr. Ebadi is this, که دکتر عبادی عزیز، شما 3 تا طرفدار کوچولو دارین تو خونه ما، من 3 تا دخترم، هر 3 تا هم شما رو میشناسن، هم اسمتون رو میشناسن و ما خیلی مدیون تمام کارهای شما هستیم. اگه لطف بکنین بفرمایید.
سلام میکنم به همه حضار گرامی. معذرت میخوام از تأخیری که در حضور من اتفاق افتاد و من راحت ترم که به فارسی صحبت کنم، زبان مادری خودم، و مریم برای شما ترجمه خواهد کرد.
My greetings to you all. I would like to apologize for the delay. We had technical problems, and I'm more comfortable speaking in Farsi, which is my mother tongue. So I will, my interpreter will translate.
همونطوری که از سایر همکاران من در این جلسه شنیدید، در ماه سپتامبر دختر جوانی در خیابان کشته شد و این آغاز انقلابی در ایران بود که همچنان هم ادامه داره.
As I'm sure you've already heard from the previous speakers, in September 2022, when a young girl was killed during the protests, it actually sparked protests. The killing of a young girl by the morality police. It started a revolution in Iran in September 2020.
علت انقلاب فقط کشته شدن یک دختر نبود، بلکه 43 سال حکومت که تأسیس شده بود به نام جمهوری اسلامی همه نوع تبعیضی در مورد زنان اعمال میکرد.
The reason for this revolution wasn't only the killing of the young girl, but it was also 43 years of discrimination against women that the Islamic Republic of Iran had brought with it since its establishment.
از تقریباً 20 روز بعد از اینکه این انقلاب پیروز شد در سال 1979، اینها گفتن که پوشیدن حجاب برای زنان، چه ایرانی باشن چه غیر ایرانی، در داخل ایران اجباریه و همه بایستی حجاب داشته باشیم. و از همون روز اختلاف با این حکومت برای زنان شروع شد و شروع کردن به اعتراض کردن.
It was just about 20 days after the establishment of the 1979 the revolution that the government of Islamic Republic made the hijab compulsory for women, not only Iranian women, but foreign women, any women in Iran. And it was since then, the very early days of the Islamic Revolution, that the Iranian women started protesting against such discrimination.
بعد از اون قوانین تبعیض‌آمیز دیگری به تصویر رسید، از جمله اینکه یک مرد میتونه 4 تا زن بگیره، هر وقت بخواد زنش طلاق بده بدون عذر موجه، اما طلاق گرفتن برای زن در ایران بسیار دشواره.
And ever since then, the Islamic Republic, they started adopting more and more discriminatory laws against women. For instance, a man is allowed to have up to 4 wives. He can divorce them at any time he chooses without justifying the reason for the divorce, whereas it's almost impossible for a woman to file for divorce.
همچنین از طبق قانون ارزش جان زن نیمی از ارزش جان مرد، یعنی اگر من و برادرم با هم بریم تو خیابون و فرضاً با ماشین تصادف کنیم، خسارتی که به برادرم میدن 2 برابر چیزی که به من تعلق بگیره.
Another example of such discrimination is that the life of a woman is considered to be worth half of that of a man. For instance, if my brother and I happen to be involved in some car accident, and the court would award my brother, because he's a man, twice as much in compensation than it would award me.
اینها چند نمونه از قوانین تبعیض‌آمیز علیه زنانه که من به عنوان نمونه ارائه دادم، ولی که وضعیت در ایران برای زنان خیلی بدتر از اینه.
These were just a couple of examples I gave you of many discriminatory laws that exist in Iran against women, but the real situation for women in Iran is far worse.
اعتراضات زنان همونطوری که گفتم از هفته اول تأسیس این جمهوری شروع شد، اما متاسفانه مردها در اون و احزاب سیاسی در اون موقع از زنان حمایت نمی‌کردند و چپ‌ها معتقد بودن که چون ما داریم با امپریالیسم جهانی مبارزه میکنیم این چیزی نیست و تحمل کنید، بعد از پیروزی ما بر امپریالیسم همه چی درست میشه. و بعد از اون جنگ صدام حسین به ایران حمله کرد، 8 سال جنگ با عراق داشتیم و میگفتن که به خاطر امنیت ملی هیچ کس صحبت نکنه، اما زنها اعتراض خودشون داشتن ولی به تنهایی و کسی از اونها حمایت نمیکرد.
As I said, the Iranian women began their protests very early on, in fact, a week after the Islamic Republic was established. But in those days, unfortunately, they did not receive any support from the men and political parties. For instance, the leftists were telling the women, look, we are fighting global imperialism at the moment, so just endure a bit longer. Once we have defeated global imperialism, then we will try and come to your help and change the laws. And then it was the 8-year war again with Iraq, with Saddam Hussein started, and then they had the excuse that, oh, national security at the moment is more important. But nevertheless, the women continued their protests, but as I said, in those days, they did not have any support from the men.
اما احزاب سیاسی و مردای ایرانی فراموش کردن که ستم مثل ویروسه، وقتی که وارد جامعه بشه بلافاصله همه رو مبتلا میکنه. در اولین لحظه بایستی مبارزه با این ویروس کرد ولی همه آلوده میشن. به همین دلیل هم ستم هم مانند همین عمل کرد و همون احزاب کمونیستی همشون به وسیله حکومت دستگیر شدن، تعداد زیادشون در زندان به قتل رسیدن. هر کس در ایران هر صدای مخالفی رو حکومت یا دستگیر کرد و یا به زندان انداخت.
The political parties and men in Iran, they'd forgotten how oppression is like a virus, and if you do not stop that virus immediately, it becomes an epidemic. So as a result of the oppression, the communists and the political party members, in fact, any dissident voice, the government would arrest them, put them in prison. Many died in prison, many murdered by the regime. And this is the price that they had paid.
و این بار مردان هم همراه زنان اعتراض میکنن و به خیابون میان، برای اینکه مردان هم متوجه شدن که دموکراسی از حقوق زن شروع میشه و نمیشه درخواست دموکراسی داشت ولی که به حقوق زنها بی‌اعتنا بود.
However, in the recent protests that started in September, the men joined the women in the protests because they realized that democracy begins with defending the rights of women, and until as long as they ignore the rights of women, there is not going to be democracy.
شعار ما در این انقلاب زن زندگی آزادی است که این شعار دو وجه داره. وجه منفی اون نفی استبداد دینی حاکم بر ایران و وجه مثبت اون در خواست حکومتی دموکرات و سکولاره، برای اینکه فقط در یک حکومت دموکرات و سکولار است که شعار زن زندگی آزادی قابل تحققه.
The slogan of this recent revolution has been women, life and freedom. Now, on the one hand, this slogan means a fight against the despotic theocracy that exists in Iran. And on the other, it also calls for a democratic and secular government, because it's only under such a government that this slogan could be realized.
در این تظاهرات تعداد زیادی از جوانها زن و مرد کشته شدن که دولت هیچ وقت آماری رو اعلام نمیکنه، اما از طریق اعلام خانواده ها و پس از راستی آزمایی تا الان میتونیم بگیم که حداقل 540 فرد رو در خیابان کشتند.
In these protests, many young men and women were killed. The government has unfortunately not published any statistics about the number of the deaths, but what we have heard, and we've heard that from the families of the victims, once we verified this, we can say that at least 540 protesters have been killed so far.
حداقل 20,000 نفر دستگیر شدن که از این تعداد 4 نفر هم تا الان اعدام شدن و تعداد زیادی حبس‌های طویل مدت گرفتن.
Of the protesters, some 20,000 have been arrested, 4 of whom have been executed, and many have been given long-term prison sentences.
این انقلاب به راه شروع شده و میدونید که انقلاب گاهی اوقات صدا بالا میره و صدا گاهی اوقات پایین میاد، ولی کن متوقف نمیشه و ایستگاه آخر و حرف آخر مردم تغییر رژیمه.
The revolution has started again. And as you know, with any revolution, it has its highs and lows. Sometimes the voices of the protesters are much higher and sometimes they're not. But the final demand of the revolutionaries is that this regime has.
سوالی که همیشه مطرح میشه این است که آلترناتیو چیه و چه فرد و یا افرادی جانشین این حکومت خواهند شد، که باید بگم که در ایران آلترناتیو ما در ایران هست و جوانان ایرانی خیلی خوب مبارزه میکنن و خوشبختانه گروه دارن با هم دیگه همکاری میکنن و این انقلاب رو رهبری کردن.
The question that people ask us is, what is the alternative? What happens if this regime goes and who will take over? I have to say that the alternative is already in Iran and is very active. The young Iranians, they are very active and they are fighting very successfully, and fortunately they work in networks, in little groups, and they coordinate in a very, very good way. And they will be leading the revolution.
من میدونم که فرصت من خیلی کوتاهه، بنابراین صحبتم رو تموم میکنم که بتوانم از شما بشنوم و اگر سوالی باشه جواب بدم.
I know my time is very limited. That is why I'm going to finish my speech now, and I would like to hear what you have to say. And should you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
دکتر عبادی عزیز خیلی ممنون، تشکر. اگه اجازه بدین من به انگلیسی صحبت بکنم و سوالا رو بپرسم. Friends, I think a good chunk of the audience are Farsi speakers, but I also know that there are a lot of non-Farsi speakers. So as promised, to keep it in English, we will for the most part. At least I will. Now, first of all, the chat is now open if you want to put your questions. But can I just ask you kindly, questions, please, no comments, and keep them short. Otherwise, I'm a very slow reader and I might miss them. I think the first question is to Dr. Ebadi. And I think the burning question on people's minds is, what is the progress with this Shuraya Etilaf that was announced a few days ago? And Shuraya Etilaf is the cooperative of the opposition figures that was announced at George Washington University last Friday, I think.
همونطوری که گفتم گروه مردم ایران با هم متحد میشن و اینها با هم در همکاری هستن. گروهی که در واشنگتن 8 نفر پیام فرستادن، اولا 8 نفر نیستن و تعداد خیلی بیشتره. بعد از ثانی اینها هم یکی از گروه هایی هستن که خودشون با هم و در مجموع با بقیه دارن همکاری میکنن.
As I said in my speech, there are several groups working together, coordinating their actions, and they are working in very united fashion. As for the coalition in Washington, D.C., it's not just made up of 8 people. It is a lot more than 8. But as I said, they are also another group. And there are many groups who are fighting this regime together.
زیبایی این ائتلاف‌های چندگانه این است که همه به نوعی با هم در همکاری هستند و خواست همگی یه چیزه: حکومت باید برود و حکومت آینده در صندوق رای که تحت نظارت سازمان ملل متحد بایستی رفراندوم برگزار بشه تعیین می شود و همه ما بر این مسئله توافق داریم و ارتباط ما برای ادامه دادن این انقلاب تا پای صندوق رای.
The beauty of these coalitions is that they work in unison, they're very united, they are coordinating, as I said, with each other, and they all have a unanimous demand, which is this regime has to go, and that the people have to decide the future government through the ballot box, through a referendum under the auspices of the United Nations. So our contacts as groups with one another will continue until such a referendum takes place.
خیلی ممنون. The next burning question that we have written up here, there's a few others that I'll try and get to. The question is on transitional justice. یا عدالت در دوره گذار. Firstly, Dr. Ebadi, and then I'm going to ask Gloriz Jun and Negar Jun to also chime in. This concept of transitional justice, what does it look like in practical terms for Iran?
عدالت در دوران گذار به دورانی میگن که این رژیم ساقط شده و رژیم جدید هنوز مستقر نشده. یک پریودی که فاصله میفته اسمش دوران گذاره که در این دوران چندین مسئله باید مورد توجه قرار بگیره که یکی از اونها اجرای عدالت برای کسانی که از رژیم سابق صدمه خوردن.
Now, this transitional justice, what it means is it defines the gap between the moment this regime is overthrown and until the new government takes over. And in this period, several issues should be taken into consideration, one of which is that justice should there should be justice for those who have been victims by this government.
اجرای عدالت در این دوران بسیار اهمیت داره و همونطوری که گفتم خوشبختانه همه گروه‌های ائتلافی بر این عقیده هستند که اعدام ممنوع، شکنجه باید ممنوع و جنایتکاران بایستی در یک دادرسی عادلانه محاکمه بشن که حق دسترسی به وکیل داشته باشن و رسیدگی ها بایستی علنی و حتی از تلویزیون پخش بشه که تمام مردم ایران ببینن و این یکی از مواردی است که مورد توافق همه ائتلاف هاست.
The implementation of justice is of utmost importance, and fortunately the coalition groups are all very unanimous in the opinion that there should no longer be death penalty, there should be no torture, and criminals should be brought to book in a fair trial with due process. They should have access to lawyers, and there should be full transparency, and the trials should be broadcast on TV.
Very Mamnoon, thank you. Gloriz John, perhaps we can ask your views on this point, because given your work in some of the nations that had to be rebuilt and where you made reference to the truth process and the reconciliation process, just so by way of birth and education and diversification, apart from what it is, why do we need a transitional justice blueprint?
Yes, so obviously transitional justice is very important to me in particular just because of my work, but I think as Dr. Ebadi has pointed out, it's something that is needed for the transition to happen. So we need, and I'm repeating myself to some extent, we need a precedent for what justice looks like in a human rights-based system. It's transparency, it's a fair trial, it's legal counsel, and to rebuild not only our institutions, but sort of that culture of human rights. One thing I think that we need to think about, though, where a massive atrocity like this has happened for 43 years, where there is thousands, if not millions of people affected, is that we can only hold trials for so many people. But and that is really important. We need to hold the regime leaders to account, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Basij, all of, the leaders need to be held to account. But there'll be a layer underneath that where there has to be a process for victims to tell their stories and for the history of Iran to be recorded without necessarily having the ability to hold trials for every individual case. So there'll be, because it's so massive, we will need multiple processes for that transition to happen, and for all the victim groups to feel like they were included, they were able to tell their stories, and for a clear record to be set. The next step after that, because we can't imprison every single person or bring them to trial even, is that victims need to be able to access some form of reparation without needing to go through the trial process. So as a group, and I'm thinking of some of those groups like the Baha'i community, like Baluch, whether it's Kurdish, whether it's the Rainbow community, where there are reparation mechanisms for victims who haven't gone through the trial process, because that's just not possible. So there'll be layers to this, but we would start with that justice process as a precedent too.
Thank you, Gloriz. And Negar Jan, I think from your perspective, a non-legal perspective, how do you see the civil society engagement and the necessity for civil society engagement when it comes to something as important as transitional justice?
Yes, just quickly before I quickly say hello, salam, Khan Dr. Ebadi. شما همیشه رول مدل هممون بودین و واقعا به خاطر همه کارهایی که کردین بسیار ممنون. I think it is, so for me, look at what happened when we moved from 1978, 1979, and there was no limitations, no transitional justice. So whatever reason that revolution happened, we ended up in the period of terror where there was hundreds of people were executed. Then we had this institutionalization of violence in the system that continued, resulted in, according to Amnesty International, 30,000 were about executed by the late 80s when the war was over, and this continues. Now, at some stage, unfortunately, there is a connection in our political culture in Iran. There is a connection between violence and the show of power. And it has sustained itself, unfortunately, in the modern politics of Iran. So one of the things that we have to do, and to me, that's a very difficult step, is to have difficult conversations about how to move on, how to have this transitional model, not only through the institutional system, but also not to have thousands of people in front of your court system who want death for somebody, who want execution for somebody. Actually developing a culture that understands that the only way we can proceed and we can have a multi-political party system is to stop this political violence at some stage and actually separate the idea of power and violence from each other in our political system. I think that's a much bigger step to me, to have this cultural change and rethinking about what power would look like if there is no political prisoners, if there is no execution, if there is no torture. What does it look like? How would a power show itself? And I think that's a step will give the legitimacy and the foundation that any institution requires to develop a very human rights-centric model of procedure and practices that we can follow.
Thank you. Yeah, and those are all very good points. We don't want, and these are in some of the comments that are coming up, we don't want a system that encourages or pushes for revenge to be taken. People have to be answerable, but not going and seeking revenge. I think it's terrible Farsi, talafi jui, right? You don't want to go and seek revenge for what's happened, but rather come to a position, as Gloriz said, in some circumstances, without a court process, because it's just impossible.
Although I do want to clarify, Farajan, if I can just jump in, because I see a question there. We certainly need a criminal justice process as well. So as Dr. Ebadi has said, and certainly I would not be a lawyer without you, Dr. Ebadi, that you're absolutely a role model. But so we need that. We need to be able to say, even if you are the grand Ayatollah or the president of our country, we can call you Janayatkar. We can bring you to justice. So we definitely need that, but we might need a process under that for the masses of other issues we need to capture in the record.
Yeah, that's right. What you can't have is people just walking away because we want to have love and peace, so to speak. You're right. There has to be a balance between those who have to answer and what we call mass justice in circumstances like the minority groups or the minority religious groups that you've identified. On that point, this is a question I think for everyone, but I'll start with Dr. Ebadi Aziz. Various groups are working towards a blueprint of justice and are putting the building blocks in place to build the future justice blueprint of Iran. Associations like the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists, some of you know about, Shurای Milliye Huquqdanan, they're trying to bring a group, a cooperative, an etelaf, to bring in legal academics around the world. What are your views, Dr. Ebadi, on ائتلافs on cooperatives like that. Iranian lawyers living in the West diaspora to work together to bring this blueprint for the future justice system of Iran and the blueprint of transitional justice.
من اگر ممکنه ترجمه کنم، من شاید اشتباه فهمیده باشم که شما اتحاد حقوقدانان رو برای اجرای عدالت صحبتت بود.
بله، من به مریم خانم زحمت دادم به فارسی خودم بگم. بخوام البته شکسته است، ولی سوال این بودش که ائتلاف‌ها هستند، گروه‌های هستند، گروه‌های خیلی مختلف و وکلای ایرانی که در غرب هستن، بچه‌های مثل گوریز جان، بنده، بقیه و یک گروهی به اسم شورای ملی حقوقدانان که با تمام حقوقدانان ایرانی نژاد کار میکنن که این بلوپرینت، حالا بلوپرینت بخشیم به فارسی نمیدونم چی میشه، بلوپرینت جاستس سیستم رو بسازن. سوالی که پرسیده میشه اینه که نظر شما چی هستش که این گروه ها، این ائتلاف‌ها و تمام این خبره‌کارا، تکنوکرات‌ها با همدیگه جمع بشن که در بیرون ایران برای آینده ایران این ساختگی بشه.
همونطوری که من گفتم، گروه های مختلف همینطوری دارن با هم ائتلاف و همکاری میکنن و همه اینها هم با هم به نوعی همفکر و در ارتباط هستن و جلسات متعددی هم هست برای همفکری همه. از جمله در ماه آینده 3 روز در سان فرانسیسکو یک پلتفرمی رو معرفی میکنن که با استفاده از اون پلتفرم ارتباط گرفتن گروه ها با همدیگه خیلی راحت تر میشه. خود اون ائتلاف نیست، پلتفرم داره معرفی میشه و این ابتکار تعدادی از معروفترین مهندسین آیتی ما هستن که با هم کار کردن، این پلتفرم رو دارن ارائه میدن و معرفی میکنن به همه که من هم در اون معرفی شرکت میکنم، برای اینکه خودم هم میخوام آشنا بشم با عملکرد این پلتفرم که چگونه ازش استفاده بکنیم که همه با هم راحت‌تر بتوانیم در ارتباط بیشتر باشیم.
Okay, as I said, there are many coalition groups. They're all unanimously working together and they're liaising with one another, and they hold various sessions in order to coordinate their actions. But to make this much easier for them, next month there is going to be, for 3 days in San Francisco, they're going to have a seminar during which they will introduce a platform. And the idea of this platform is to make it easier for these various groups, opposition groups, to liaise with one another. And this platform will be run by our expert Iranian IT technicians. And I will myself also, I plan to take part in this seminar, which will be held in San Francisco, and to familiarize myself even with this platform and how we can use this platform to achieve optimal results.
ضمناً میخوام اضافه کنم به یکی از این ائتلافات که ائتلافات مهندسین تحصیل کرده خیلی خوبه که در خارج از ایران اینا با هم ائتلاف کردن و ائتلاف اینا راجع به این است که چگونه تکنولوژی های ارتباطی رو به ایران ببرن. از جمله کارهایی که اینا میکنن که من میتونم بگم و مخفی نیست، VPN های متعددی که ساختن و به ایران ارسال کردن و یا استارلینک هایی که به ایران فرستاده شده از راه قاچاق و اینکه چگونه این استارلینک ها میتونن با همدیگه مرتبط باشن و به اصطلاح تعداد بیشتری رو پوشش بدن. اینا یه چیزایی است که راجع بهش کار شده و داره کار میشه و ائتلاف مهندسین خیلی با ارزش و مفیده برای مردم ایران، چه الان که در حال مبارزه هستند و چه در آینده.
I would also like to add another coalition which is playing a very important role, and that is the coalition formed of Iranian expert technicians and engineers who are doing their best to make communication among these groups a lot easier. For instance, I can tell you some of the things they do, which is very open. They are trying to send VPNs, more and more VPNs to Iran, as well as Starlinks, which they are smuggling into Iran to make it easier for these groups to interact with one another and to make sure that there is, to give them much better coverage as well. So I think the work of this coalition is incredibly valuable, not only for the Iranian people now during the protests, but also it will be very useful for the future of Iran as well.
Thank you. And I think that was in answer to a few people putting in the chat, what can we do? I understand that a lot of people attending tonight are academics or experts in their area. Now you've heard the answer, multiple answers. The lawyers, there is a group of lawyers or activists who are doing it, the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists. There are groups, technocrats in engineering, in computer programming, in physical material that's being transported to Iran. And what Dr. Ebadi Aziz mentioned in San Francisco coming up, keep an eye out. There'll be matters published in relation to it. Now, I'm told that we have 7 minutes before the program kicks us all out, but a burning question that's been asked in the chat is about the IRGC designation, SEPA. There's a big push internationally here in Australia. I'm in our country's capital, and there's a big push here. I know there's a push in New Zealand. There is a big push in basically everywhere except America that's already designated. The question is, and if I can ask the speakers to keep it short just so we can all get in a few words. One, should SEPA be designated as a terrorist group, and why is it important? دکتر عبادی عزیز، من سوال به فارسی میکنم، اگه لطف بکنین جواب کوتاه بدین. فکر کنم 4 دقیقه دیگه 5 دقیقه دیگه اتوماتیکلی کات میشه، بعدن گلریز جان و نگار جان جواب میدن. سوال این بودش که این پوش بین‌المللی که هستش که سپاهو در لیست تروریستی قرار بدن در تمام کشورهای مختلف، چه اروپا کلکتیولی یا چه کشورهای اروپایی، استرالیا که ما داریم پوش میکنیم، گلریز جان و دوستانش توی همکارش توی نیوزیلند. سوال اینه که اولا دلیلش چیه که سپاه بره تو لیست تروریستی و به منفعتاش چیه؟ یعنی چه فرقی میکنه برای مردم ایران یا ماها که اگه تو لیست تروریستی؟
تمام خشونت هایی که در ایران اعمال میشه توسط گروه های مختلف سپاه انجام میشه و علاوه بر این که مردم ایران رو سرکوب میکنن، در از جهت بین المللی هم اینا آرامش منطقه رو به هم زدن. از جمله به حوثی های یمن کمک کردن و وضعیت یمن رو به اون حالت اسفناک در آوردن. از جمله اینکه گروه های شبه نظامی در عراق ایجاد کردن و به اون صورت این کشور رو نظمش رو به هم زدن. بیش از 35 ساله که حزب الله لبنان رو تسلیحاتش رو، هزینه هاش رو تامین میکنن. در سوریه اینها مستقر هستند به کمک بشار اسد و سرکوب مردم اونجا هنوز هم ادامه داره و اخیراً هم میبینیم که با ارسال موشک و پهپاد برای روسیه باعث سرکوب و کشتار مردم در اوکراین شدن. بنابراین اگر سپاه جزء لیست تروریستی قرار بگیره، از خیلی از دیگه کسی با اون هیچ کشوری نمیتونه با اون ارتباط برقرار کنه. و از سمت دیگر بیش از 2/3 منابع مالی ایران در اختیار سپاهه و اینها تمام ارکان قدرت رو در ایران در اختیار دارن. بنابراین وقتی که اونها رو تحریم بکنن، در حقیقت مردم راحت تر مبارزه میکنن و بسیار زودتر پیروز میشن و دموکراسی به ایران میاد که اگر ایران دموکرات بشود منطقه آروم میشه.
All the violence that's being meted out by the IRGC groups in Iran, the crackdown, the violent and brutal repression of the people, that's one reason. Another reason is that there will be calm and peace in the region once they designate the IRGC as a terrorist group. Look at some of what the government has done through the IRGCs. They have supplied the Houthis in Yemen with weapons, which has exacerbated the situation in that region. And there have been paramilitaries formed by the Iranian regime in Iraq, which is also disrupting peace in that country. For 35 years, they have been funding and equipping Hezbollah of Lebanon with weapons. Also in Syria, they have been aiding Bashar Assad to suppress his own people. And and even more recently, as you all know, they have been supplying Russia with kamikaze drones with which it has been attacking Ukraine. So all this means that once the revolutionary IRGC is being placed on the terrorist group, there will be more peace in the region. And also bear in mind that 2/3 of Iranian financial resources are in the hands of the IRGC, and they are also involved in the hierarchy, power hierarchy in Iran. They play a big part. Therefore, sanctioning the IRGC would make it much easier for Iranian people to succeed in their protests and bring democracy to Iran. And once we have democracy in Iran, the whole region will be calmer and peaceful.
Gloriz, your views on designating SEPA?
Yeah, I've been one of the leaders of this call in New Zealand in government, and so I'll answer it. And I know the question is about what about the fact that we as Iranians get called terrorists anyway. Well, what I was going to say is it works in our favor to say actually some people in Iran can be called terrorists. To identify the individual terrorist groups is actually in our favor as Iranians overseas. We are Iranians, and we can point the finger at our government agencies, our security agencies who are committing violence and committing human rights abuses and say, according to international law, this is a terrorist group, and we are not that group. We as Iranians, we too want this group to be held to account, to be called a terrorist entity. And I think that's what's been missing, where in the West, we are seen as a mass of terrorists because we're from the Middle East. And for the Western nations to see that we understand human rights, we want freedom, we want democracy, but we can point the finger even at our own agencies and say, this is who the terrorists are. It actually works to educate the West. And that's to our favor. As an Iranian overseas, I need my government to know that I'm capable of identifying terrorists, whether they're Iranian or not. And that's what my call has been based on. And we need them sanctioned. As Dr. Ebadi has said, these are the people committing the violence, and we need the Western nations to stop trading, stop funding, stop holding the bank accounts of terrorists who are stealing the money, the oil money, the blood money that's coming out of Iran. So in a practical sense, we need it, but in a cultural sense, I think it works to our favor as well.
Thank you, Ghahraman. Negar, what are your views from a non-legalistic perspective on the designation of SEPA?
Yeah, it's a privilege to speak with three lawyers, I must say. But I think it is very interesting that, to me, international community has sets of principles, and those principles matter. So if we do believe that the international community has a responsibility to systems and to regulations and security forces that dominate and violate human rights, we should show reactions. And particularly in the Islamic in the IRGC context, they have not only have committed huge gross violation of human rights inside Iran, but they have interfered in the domestic affairs of countries around the region. Dr. Ebadi mentioned Yemen. I would also like to add Iraq to it. In cases we hear reports from Afghanistan, so it's not a very banal model of regime, and it has promotes certain ideas about how to address or how to oppose the modes of globalizations that are very inherently violent. So it has a very binary view of the world, whether it is an absolute truth is with them and there is no other truth. And I think all of these things actually create an environment where they violate many of the international communities and international rules, which means that the international community should be in a way responsible and uphold the principles that it put aside.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting you brought up, and I think Dr. Ebadi did as well, the provision of military material and specifically drones, pahbods, to Russia to use against the Ukrainian, not just army, but civilians. And the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency of America, took the very unusual step about 48 hours ago, I think it was now, so 2 days ago, and released a declassified report which sets out in detail, excruciating detail, the use of Iranian-made and supplied drones in the Ukraine by Russia. So I think it was Shahid 136, Shahid 131, and the other one that the name escapes me. And this is, at least in my experience, the most overt that America has been with its classified material about on these topics of provision of arms, etc. So there is no doubt that Iran is providing it. What some people don't know is that as late as September last year, there was evidence, which is now declassified, that Iranian military personnel were in Crimea, helping the very people that the West has already sanctioned and in various terms has taken the ability and the right of movement away, that is the Russian army and Russian personnel. But for some reason, the IRGC is not in that category just yet. So I think a message that comes out loud and clear from this panel is that SEPA, the IRGC, is not the official army of Iran. It is not a representative of the army. And as a matter of legal technicality, there is no impediment. There is a political impediment, but there is no legal impediment to list them as a terrorist organization. And I think they should, the governments of the West should get their act together. But finally, before we wrap up, can I give the final question to either Gloriz or Negar or a combination of the two of you, of any questions you have of Dr. Ebadi Aziz to wrap this session up?
I have quite a few questions, but but I guess my burning question would be about women's engagement in that transitional justice process and how we can best empower women in the peace process that we need to engage in, and the roadmap for women specifically. Do we need separate processes? Do we need quotas? How do we best ensure that women have a place in leadership in the process that's coming? I think we need the translation.
Yes, I need.
خانم عبادی، خلاصش اینه که در این دوران گذار ما چطوری میتونیم نقش زنان رو پررنگ‌تر بکنیم و چطوری بهشون کمک کنیم که قدرتیابی بهشون بدیم، کمکشون کنیم که بتونن یه نقشی ایفا بکنن در این دوران. چیکار میتونیم بکنیم؟ چه گام هایی میتونیم از الان برداریم در این راستا؟
در دوران بعد از این انقلاب، در این transitional justice process.
گذار، بله گفتید دوران گذار. بله.
خوشبختانه همونطوری که گفتم سالیان سال مبارزه برای احقاق حقوق زنان ایران رو توانمند کرده. بیش از 50% دانشجویان دانشگاه‌های ما همیشه دختر بودن و حتی خانواده‌های سنتی هم در اثر این انقلاب اخیر مهسا، اینها هم رویهشون و دیدگاهشون نسبت به زن عوض شده. به عنوان مثال در استان سیستان و بلوچستان زنها اونجا سنت قوی تره، سنت پدرسالار قوی تره تا سایر نقاط ایران و شما حضور زنها رو در اعتراضات دیگر، سایر اعتراضات خیلی کم میدیدید. اما در این اعتراض زنان بلوچی واقعا چشمگیرن. یعنی اصلا زن بلوچی امروز قابل قیاس با زن بلوچی 10 سال قبل نیست. خوشبختانه این ستم فراوان باعث آگاهی و بیداری زنان هم شده. خیلی راحت سنت ها رو دارن عقب میزنن و مدرن شدن به نسبت سابق. بنابراین نگران این بخش نبایستی بود. اما در این حال ما نبایستی همه امور رو هم واگذار به آینده بکنیم. از الان میتوان طراحی کرد که در دوران گذار در مشاغلی که ضرورتاً باید ایجاب بشه، از جمله شورای موقت رهبری، از جمله شورای اجرای عدالت انتقالی و یا طراحی اقتصادی و یا شورای تامین امنیت عمومی، تمام اینها بایستی زنان حضور فعال داشته باشند و سهمیه برای زنان در تمامی این شوراها بایستی در نظر گرفته بشه. اما تکرار میکنم من نگران این مسئله نیستم، برای اینکه زنان خیلی خوب یاد گرفتن که حقشون رو از دهن شیرم که شده بیرون بکشن.
Fortunately for many years, as I've mentioned, the Iranian women have been extremely active, have been fighting to realize their rights. So they have managed to empower themselves. As you know, over 50% of our university students are women. And even those who come from traditional families, their outlooks have changed, especially since the September revolution that was sparked by Massa's killing, and the views in traditional parts of Iran, such as, for instance, in Sistan Baluchistan province that has is very patriarchal traditionally. The viewpoints have changed, and the Baluchi women are a lot more active now. You cannot compare Baluchi women now and how active they are to the way they were 10 years ago. So I also think that women should, we should start giving women more and more jobs now so that they should be able to play a part in the transitional justice space. For instance, they should be given roles in the Interim Leadership Council, Interim Justice Council, Social Security Council, and so on and so forth. And the women, as I said, I'm not worried about the future of the women, because I think thanks to this recent revolution, women have become more aware. There's been more awareness, more awakening among women, even in traditional areas, and they have become more modern, and they're managing to keep up with a zeitgeist. So I'm not worried about that, and I think the women know their rights and they're going to fight for its realization.
Wonderful. Negar John, last question goes to you.
Very quickly. خانم دکتر عبادی، همونطور که شما اشاره کردین توی زمان 57 انقلاب 57 خیلی از زنها شروع کردن با سیاست‌های آپرسیو دولت جمهوری اسلامی مبارزه کردن و تو خیابون اومدن، ولی به دلایل بسیار زیادی مردم تو اون زمان و احزاب سیاسی همونطور که شما اشاره کردین از زنان حمایت نکردن. نسل من خیلی نگران اینه که این اتفاق در یه شرایط دیگه دوباره بیفته. یعنی من میخوام بدونم که نظر شما چطوریه که ما چطوری میتونیم مردا رو بیشتر تشویق کنیم که بیشتر و بیشتر از این انقلاب زن زندگی آزادی حمایت کنن. Sorry, I just very quickly translate. I just asked Dr. Ebadi that due to the history of the revolution in 1979 and 78, we didn't have many men or political parties supporting the struggle for women for equality or against compulsory hijab. So I was just asking Dr. Ebadi whether she has any advice of how we can encourage more men to support the woman life freedom revolution.
همونطوری که قبلا گفتم، مردا الان دیگه متوجه اشتباه خودشون شدن و فهمیدن که دموکراسی از حقوق زن میگذره و فکر نمی کنم مجددا مرتکب اشتباه تاریخی خودشون بشن. اما برای اطمینان خاطر میبایستی همونطوری که گفتم ما برای مشاغل مهم سهمیه‌ای برای زنها قائل بشیم که حتی اگر در یک رشته‌ای در یک موردی زنان مجرب کم باشن، که البته تردید دارم برای که گفتم همیشه بیش از 50% تحصیل کرده ما خانمند، بیشتر از 50%. بنابراین فکر نمی کنم با این مشکل مواجه بشیم، ولی کرد حتی اگر این اتفاق هم بیفته در یک رشته‌ای ما تحصیل کرده زن کمتر داشته باشیم، وجود سهمیه باعث میشه که زنان رو زودتر در اون رشته تقویت میکنن که بیان بالا. بنابراین با تعیین سهمیه میشه جلوی اتفاقات ناگواری رو گرفت که تاریخ تکرار نشه.
خیلی ممنون.
Okay, as I said before, that the women have now thankfully realized that democracy cannot be realized without first realizing the rights of women. And I think to that end, it is very important, although the Iranian women are very capable, I think it's very important to have quotas in all occupations for women. If, for instance, in certain occupations we feel there is a dearth of women's presence in that particular occupation, although I doubt that very much, because as I said, over 50% of students are women. But if there are any skills and that we feel women lack, and we need that expertise in certain occupations, it's important that we introduce quotas to help encourage and promote women to achieve their rights.
Thank you. And I think one last word is just to remind everyone that Aghay Khomeini came to Iran on the 1st of February 1979. Compulsory hijab came in a month after. And the first uprising or the first protest was by the women of Iran on the 8th of March, a month and a week later. So Shirzanan Iran have always been at the forefront of freedom. And as an Iranian man who's grown up most of his life in Australia, at least for my part, and those around me, I can assure you that, as they say, Zan Zendagi Azadi and Mard Mihan Abadi, Shana be Shana Ham, and together I think we will ultimately achieve what is the aspiration of all Iranians. Friends, I know we've gone over the allocated time. We had some technical difficulties, but can I formally thank and pay my gratitude and respect to the team that put this event together, the international community of Iranian academics, the ICOIA, and also supported and sponsored by the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW in Sydney and New Zealand's Massey University. And so thank you to the organizers. 2 words. I know there are a lot of people who've been asking in the chat how they can get involved. Please get in touch with the organizers. Obviously, you received an invite from a friend of a friend of a friend, but get in touch with the organizers. Lawyers can seek out the details of Etalafat Huquqi. Engineers can do the same. What Dr. Ebadi Aziz noted about the conferences, the 3-day gatherings in San Francisco, that's coming up. It will become publicized soon, but I can share the details through the organizers and they can share it with you. And finally, a very warm word of gratitude. Sarkar Khanom Ebadi, خیلی ممنون. میدونم که شما اولا که سرتون خیلی شلوغه و خیلی از شما خواهش میکنن که تو این برنامه هاشون تشریف داشته باشین و ما چقدر خوشحالیم که شما این اینویتیشن ما رو قبول کردین و اومدین. امروز شما شب ما. خیلی ممنون و انشالله که بار آخر نیست نباشه. در خدمتتون باشیم. نگار جان، گوریز جان, thank you so much for all the love and the effort and the sweat and tears that you guys put in organizing it. And hopefully this will be the first of many of events like this.
من هم بسیار سپاسگزارم از فرصتی که برای گفتگو برای من قائل شدید و خوشحالم که در هر جای دنیا که من میرم ایرانیان تحصیل کرده متحد با یکدیگر برای وطن مبارزه میکنن. در حقیقت شماها ثابت میکنید که از ایران رفتید ولیکن ایران هنوز در قلب شماست و امیدوارم روزی نه چندان دور در وطنمون همدیگر رو ملاقات بکنیم.
I would also like to express my gratitude for having been given this opportunity, and it was a pleasure for me to meet with Iranians abroad and how active you are. I'm always proud of, wherever I go around the world, I'm very proud of seeing so many highly educated and active Iranian, and I hope one day in the very near future we'll all manage to meet in Iran.
و خیلی ممنون از دانشگاه و تاکید ممنون از دانشگاه و کسانی که این گروه رو این جلسه رو ترتیب دادن و متشکرم از تمام افرادی که مستمع هستن و حرفای من رو شنیدن و خدا نگهدار شما.
خدا نگهدار.
And also thank you to the university, all the participants and all the organizers. May God bless you all.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Next time will be better. Thank you.
خداحافظ.
خداحافظ.
خیلی ممنون.